Path of Exile 2 finally comes out tomorrow. We've been waiting for this game for like 6 years. And in this video, I'm going to show you guys what I'm thinking about starting and some cool interactions I've discovered in my research so far. So I'm not wasting any time. Let's get into it. Now, a few quick caveats as always. Obviously, we don't know everything there is to know about Path of Exile 2 yet. The game is not fully released. So I'm bringing you this information based on what we know so far and based on the plethora of research I've done over the past week, either watching, interviews or gameplay videos from GGG. So I'm just aiming to provide you guys with some information that maybe you didn't know about yourself and some cool combinations that I think will really help you pop off when Path of Exile 2 comes out. As confident as I am in showcasing you the things I'm going to talk about today, obviously all of this is subject to change. We could get a patch tonight that none of this is the same. So, bear that in mind. But again, based on the information we have, these are the things I wanted to show you guys and what I'm thinking about starting in Path of Exile 2. So for you guys that are new here, who am I? I'm Lord Fluffy. I have been a isometric ARPG gamer for the past, decade at least. I put an erroneous amount of hours into Diablo 2, even more into Diablo 3, and then eventually graduated into becoming a Path of Exile main. But more specifically, if you guys have watched me play Path of Exile at all, you'll know that I'm a big lover of all things poison. Now, I also want to be completely clear here that I do think there would be like a couple best ways to play poison going in the Path of Exile 2 early access. I think that like some sort of poison burst, toxic growth setup will probably be the best way to play poison for the Pathfinder, but I'm not a really big fan of bows. I've never really been a big fan of bows. And I really want to play sort of new stuff. Like we've seen Toxic Rain, we've seen Caustic Arrow, and that's kind of what these two play like. Maybe even a little bit like Scourge Arrow. So immediately when I saw the list of skills, I immediately was brainstorming what other ways can we play poison. And of course, one thing that popped out immediately was Hand of Cheula. I do think this will be a really great way to play poison if you're going sort of, dark monk, if you will. I do think that Hand of Cheula will probably be the skill I go with if this whole build doesn't work out. But for the sake of experimentation in Path of Exile 2, I really wanted to do something that was sort of off the beaten path because we are supposed to have a lot of build variety and build possibilities in Path of Exile 2. So even though I think that the aforementioned skills will be better at doing poison, I wanted to build something sort of my own. Now, when they were showcasing the witch gameplay, I immediately fell in love with the skill called BoneStorm. You sort of channel these shards of bone above your head, and after you release the channeled ability, it shoots out all these shards of bone, and it's this pretty sweet projectile skill that looks really cool, and I'm excited to mess around with it. So immediately I'm like, how do I play this skill? And how would I make it my own? Now, the way BoneStorm works is actually pretty interesting. So one, obviously it's a channeled ability. So you hold it down and it conjures those swarm of bone spikes above your head. And then you release that channeled ability and it shoots out, however many you generated during that channeled time. But what it also does is it puts shrapnel inside the enemies you hit, which anytime they take an attack, which is, clear to note there, attack will also take an additional damage from the attack. And then it will actually scale your attack as well. And then the third interaction of the skill is that you can consume your power charges to cause the spikes to do much larger explosions. Now, what's sort of unclear about this third effect of the power charges is whether or not that damage is the shrapnel damage exploding, or it's some sort of new effect of just the bone spikes hitting more enemies in a small AoE. It's possible that it is the shrapnel, and then if it is the shrapnel, does it add it to the base physical damage of the spell instead of it making it an attack? Or is it just the shrapnel attack exploding instantly? Or is it just some new effect where, again, like I said, it's a small AoE that isn't normally there? I'm hoping it's the first where it sort of adds it to the base spell damage, but again, I feel like it would say that. Usually GGG is pretty good about their wording. Now, the way that most people will be using this is with minions. So that additional debuff that causes enemies to take more physical damage from the next attack will actually work for your minions, making it sort of a minion support skill. However, you can also proc that damage yourself with your own attacks, making an interesting argument for a, spellcaster / range attack character. Now, based on this information alone, we know it's a channeled ability, and in Path of Exile 2, you can cast skills while moving, which brings me to my next point, is how poison works in Path of Exile 2. So Path of Exile 1, you could just infinitely stack a bunch of poisons until you hit a dot cap. It was really just all about applying as many poisons as you possibly could. But in PoE 2, it's quite different. It kind of works like Ignite from PoE 1. So we have the actual description of poison here pulled up on the screen right now. But basically, poison is an ailment that deals chaos damage over time in the last 2 seconds by default. And also, poison is inflicted by the hits damage per second equal to 25% of the physical and chaos damage dealt by that hit that inflicted it. So that's really important to note. Just like in PoE 1, only physical and chaos damage can inflict poison unless you have something like Pneumatic Dagger, but I assume we're probably not going to have anything like that in this game, especially since daggers aren't in the game yet. That's really important to note that hit damage matters way more in this game than Path of Exile 1. But furthermore, poison damage cannot be directly affected by damage modifiers, but all modifiers to damage of the hit that cause the poison will affect the poison's damage. So essentially, we want to make the hit as big as we can to maximize the poison damage over time aspect of the poison that inflicts. The fourth thing is damage from poison bypasses energy shield. So yay. Now, the other interesting thing for Path of Exile 2 is the number of poisons you can apply by default is only 1. And that damage will get overridden by a more damaging poison that comes along. So if you have like some baby poisons and all of a sudden you hit with one big poison, the big poison will override the little ones. And that's fine if you like are planning on just hitting one big poison. But of course, BoneStorm is sort of a bunch of tiny physical hits that we'll be juicing up to the best of our ability. But still, we're going to be able to apply a lot of poisons here. So immediately, we basically have to go Pathfinder. So in Path of Exile 2, through the skill tree and through some gameplay I've seen, it seems like you can get up to 10 to 12 poisons, but only if you go with Pathfinder and get the overwhelming toxicity, which doubles the number of poisons you can inflict on enemies. Now, a lot of this comes at the cost of poison duration, which is a net negative. Losing poison duration is really bad for poisons. And basically everything that says we get additional poisons on the tree comes at a cost. So for example, stacking toxins, we get 20% reduced effect of poison. And again, building toxins, we get 25% of poison duration reduction. So some pretty hefty hits here, the poison. Now, of course, there's other nodes on the tree that might be poison we don't have access to yet. But the important thing to note here is only via Pathfinder can we apply, up to 10 to 12 poisons on a single enemy at once. But the other thing to note here that I really like about Pathfinder for this particular setup is the passive running assault. So 30% less movement speed penalty when using skills while moving. So because BoneStorm is a channeled ability that we have to hold down for an extended period of time, this makes this particular notable quite good. So having less of a movement speed while channeling is a net positive because, we'll be able to avoid more damage. There'd be more times that we can spend inside of channeling BoneStorm and avoiding like really bad, boss effects or incoming damage. So pretty much immediately we're going to be picking up this running assault ascendancy because we are going to try to level with BoneStorm. I think it'll be a fun ability to use and it's going to be something new and fresh. After that, we'll be picking up node number 3 here. The most damaging poisons will now spread. And then finally getting number 4, which is overwhelming toxicity, doubling the amount of poisons you inflict on enemies, but at the cost of 35% less poison duration. But again, this is the only way that we can get over 5-6 poisons on an enemy is to go Pathfinder. So if you're serious about poison, it seems like in the current state of the game, the Pathfinder will be the best way to do it until we get, sort of those new shadow ascendancies or maybe even huntress ascendancies. We'll see. For the last point, it sort of depends. Number 8 here, Relentless Pursuit. Your movement speed is unaffected by slows. That could be really good. Depends on how often we get slowed. So that's definitely a possibility because, again, we want to be channeling as much as we can, making running assault very good. There's also Traveler's Wisdom. You get 5 additional passive skill points. And I think that this is actually a skill point as well. So you technically get 6 by going this route on the tree, which isn't bad. I mean, that could be like anywhere from 10 to probably 20% more multiplicative damage, depending on how good the passives are. Again, we don't know all passives yet. Or you could just go do the simple thing and go number 1 here, which is just 50% more flash charges gained, assuming you don't get one hit by everything, which there's no mitigation in this ascendancy, which kind of sucks. But assuming you don't get one shot, you could probably heal through most things because of the amount of flash charges you have. So we'll just have to wait and see with that. I think by default 1 on paper, it seems to be the best, depending on how we get slowed. 8 could be really good. And then if we're feeling really confident and we're not getting one shot a whole heck of a lot, then 6 would be the best way to go with for the extra 6 skill points. Anyways, so speaking of the skills, we're going to quickly go over what I'm thinking for sort of the end game setup. And then we'll go over what I plan on leveling with. And there's going to be like a starter and then the dream setup here. And this Path of Exile 2 skills.com, which we'll link down in the description below. So again, this is a BoneStorm setup, and we want to be applying many poisons, and BoneStorm sort of hits with physical very often, very fast. So we'll be able to get to the poison cap real quick. And again, if we sort of do bigger hits with each BoneStorm, like those bigger poisons potentially will override the old ones, and it's not really a net negative, because it works sort of like Ignite from Path of Exile 1. Now, a big assumption here is that we'll be getting things like, poison damage from gear, or maybe even just chaos damage, either way. But there's a lot of interaction here, sort of with the skills, and I want to go over each one and sort of what I've seen. So one reason that BoneStorm would be so good with Pathfinder is because of the skill Momentum. So after moving at least 2 meters with a single use of a supported skill, the rest of that use is 40% more damage. So just as long as we move a measly 2 meters with Momentum, we get a 40% more damage multiplier on BoneStorm. Again, that should be easy because the Pathfinder Ascendancy running Assault, which you get 30% movement speed, less movement speed penalty. So moving those 2 meters should be very easy to do to get a sweet more damage multiplier. This is a physical spell, so Physical Mastery is also an easy choice here. +1 to level of supported skills. I assume this will continue to get plus to skill levels with the gem level. And of course, if you know anything about Path of Exile 1, gem levels on spell skills in particular are very, very good. So early on, those will be the first 2 you take. You're not going to really focus on making BoneStorm poison just yet. And then once you start to build out your tree and get those poison notables on the passive skill tree, which we showcased just a little bit earlier, once you start to get some of these and get all the maximum poison stacks, you could probably start thinking about making BoneStorm a poison ability. But once we do that, we want to take on multiple poison. So it lets you have an additional poison at the cost of 35% less poison duration. And then Deadly Poison, which unfortunately takes 25% damage away from the hit, which again hits skill poison in Path of Exile 2. But it gives you 75% more effective poisons from the supported skills, which is a crazy more multiplier for just poisons. Now with this last skill link, you'll probably want to have, chance to poison until you sort of get, 100% chance to poison on hit via the passive skill tree or via gear. But once you sort of hit that, there's a couple things we can do here. And we'll come back to that sort of last skill link in just a minute. Now, one thing that's really cool in Path of Exile is you can sort of weapon swap. And so in this setup, we're going to be swapping between, I assume, a wand and a, what are they called? Scepter dual wield setup and a bow. And you can set, skills to swap the weapon on demand of using the skills, sort of like the arsenal system from Diablo 4. And the reason this is really good because there is one bow skill in particular that is just amazing for poison, and it's called Toxic Growth. So Toxic Growth is kind of like Scourge Arrow from PoE 1. It sort of puts these pods on the ground, but the way it acts is very, very different. So you summon these pustules that will explode after 6 seconds on their own if you don't even touch them, which will do poison damage. And that poison damage, I assume, is some sort of cap on the skill itself. It is a little weird to me here that chaos isn't a tag, since poison is definitely chaos damage. But I assume this will be like a 2-part skill. There's just part of the skill we're not seeing as of right now. But I assume that poison damage is going to be A, based on the skill rank, and 2, based on the links that you have with it. But one of the things I noticed immediately in basically every single gameplay footage, and people maybe didn't even notice that we're playing, was they paired Toxic Growth with Corrosion. Even though Toxic Growth on its own doesn't apply a poison unless you put like Chance to Poison on it, it still does poison damage. And it does a lot of poison damage because every pod that explodes is poison damage. So basically it was almost 100% of the time proccing Corrosion, which has poisons applied by the supported skill also break armor equal to 3,500% of that poison damage dealt. So every single one of these pods exploding, even without these support gems, in the gameplay I saw, it was basically breaking enemy armor with 100% effectiveness. So it seems to be a very potent combination. Again, armor breaking is super important because it makes physical spells, physical hits, hit harder. So it's going to make our BoneStorm hit harder. And depending on how often we can practice like Corrosion full armor break with Toxic Growth, we could have something in our main skill link like Exploit Weakness, which basically says the skill does 50% more damage if the enemy is fully broken armor, but it consumes that enemy fully broken armor. So depending on how fast we can sort of proc that, we might put Exploit Weakness as a gem level here. But having this armor broken in general will make BoneStorm do more damage, which means more poison. So again, another important thing to note here is those pustules will spawn or only explode after 6 seconds. You could do something like the less duration to cause them to explode faster, but we want to apply more poison to those toxic growths. And we have a few ways of doing that in this particular setup. One is anytime we channel a BoneStorm, it's going to be poisoning. Each of those shards will poison and potentially hit a toxic growth, which will trigger more damage on the explosion of those toxic growths. We're also going to be using a skill called Plague Bear, and there is only one piece of footage I could find on the internet, but this combo is insane. So you're going to spawn the spore pods, you're going to hit Plague Bearer, and then your Plague Bearer, it doesn't work like PoE1 where it's just like damage over time. It's this big poison explosion that happens one time. And that will hit every single one of your toxic growths because it's a AoE skill. So that will make those poison growths do way more damage and 100% proc corrosion, but also obviously do a ton of poison damage because we're scaling chaos and poison damage in this setup. And I think it actually gets more attack damage because we are scaling projectile damage as well. So juicy, pretty juicy combo. But Plague Bearer won't be up all the time because one, we have to sort of build up that chaos damage into Plague Bearer. Plus we're going to use a support called Hourglass, which will make it 8-second cooldown. So this is not going to be up every single time we have a toxic growth spawn. We're also going to be using a skill called Gas Arrow, which basically is, it shoots down like this poisonous cloud, and which will infect all of the toxic growths. So yeah, there's a few ways of making sure we get maximum stored poison from those toxic growths. We actually get even more synergy happening here. So I like Concentrate Effect here because it is an AoE. I think that I will tighten up the toxic growth spawn, so you'll get a tighter concentration of those pods on top of like a boss or a single target. Again, we're using Corrosion because it will break down the enemy armor. And then we're using a skill called Armor Explosion. Now this is only good in combination with Gas Arrow. So Gas Arrow rains down a basically a poisonous cloud, but that can be ignited to do a big fiery explosion. And that's exactly what Armor Explosion will do. So if we corrode the armor, which again, every single gameplay I've seen, toxic growth basically breaks the armor of even a boss, which seems like every single time we blow up our toxic growth, we're basically going to trigger this armor explosion. And just as long as we have a gas cloud up, it's going to trigger that, sort of gas cloud explosion. But even if it doesn't, it's still an explosion, which is nice. Now, bear in mind, I don't know how accessible it is to, to get 6 links on every skill. This might actually take a while, but so I've sort of put them in priority of how I would get them, assuming we can't get, 6 links of everything very fast. Another nice thing here is you can sort, just in case maybe late game, it gets harder and harder to sort of corrode an enemy's armor with a single cast of toxic growth. We can add increased armor break, which causes the skill to break 80% more. It's a more multiplier of armor. So get that guaranteed armor break and guaranteed armor explosion. And then finally, we get break posture, which says the support skill will daze an enemy. It fully breaks the armor. And the daze lasts for 6 seconds. So that just sounds like insane CC. I don't know if mobs in PoE2 get CC reduction, but that seems OP that you'd be able to do this basically every single spawn of toxic growth. And again, Plague Bearer is that ability we talked about just a little bit earlier, where it works like Plague Bearer in PoE1, except for it's one big explosion instead of a damage over time. We're adding added chaos damage to this because it is pure poison damage, which is chaos damage in PoE2, just like it is in PoE1. What's kind of unclear here is if added chaos damage will benefit because Plague Bearer is a buff. Technically, it's a Nova skill, whatever that means. I don't know if it's an attack or it's a spell. An added chaos damage will seemingly only work if it's an attack, so bear that in mind. But moving on to Chaos Mastery, you'll add a plus level to Plague Bearer, and if it's anything like PoE1, plus levels to Plague Bearer is super powerful, so this will be a GG gem for that. We're putting Hourglass on it, which will make the poison explosion deal 35% more damage, but add +8 to the cooldown, which is totally fine here because it's going to take us time to sort of build up that poison damage. So adding +8 seconds is not a big deal at all. It's really good synergy with this setup, I feel like. And then sort of for the last two, we're going to try to make it crit. We're going to be scaling crit as much as we can in the tree, without sacrificing defense because I hate dying. And Ascendancy for Pathfinder seemingly gets no defense whatsoever. So, we have to bear that in mind. But since we can't cast it out that often, Inevitable Crit is a really good here because every basically second we get 40% increased critical strike chance up to 200. So over 5 seconds, we'll get a 200% increased critical strike chance on Plague Bearer. And then finally, crit damage, which is just a support skill, which if it does crit, it's going to do 50% increased critical strike damage bonus, but at the cost of a 20% fewer hit. But hopefully that crit chance is pretty high because it is inevitable crit. But it's worth noting here that inevitable crits would also probably be pretty good at BoneStorm because again, It's a channeled ability, so the longer we hold it down, the fewer times between each cast, it will get a nice, juicy, inevitable crit chance. So also a good option there. I would caution against crit damage in BoneStorm unless you have just an insane crit chance, because again, dots are scaled off hits, and crit damage gem, support gem, takes 20% less damage with hits. For Gas Arrow, we're going to use Bursting Plague because, again, Gas Arrow is a poison in and of itself. It's a poison damage over time. It is a single poison. We're not going to be stacking any sort of poison with this because we're not scaling its damage that hard other than scaling projectile damage. The nice thing here about Gas Arrow is I do think it will absorb that physical damage aspect, attack aspect of BoneStorm, and add that to the poison damage of Gas Arrow itself if it's not consumed by toxic growth. So that's sort of that additional synergy we get from using BoneStorm. But with the first link, we like Bursting Plague. Poison from the support skill also has 200% of damage per second as Plague, up to a maximum of 30% of the enemy's value. Now, this isn't like a damage over time we're applying. It's just like a potential explosion, assuming that enemy dies. So it's just a nice like additional link we can get for AoE clear. We're putting area of effect just to make sure that every single toxic growth gets hit by this Gas Arrow, and then if it explodes, it's a bigger range of things that can explode. We're also going to be using close combat. We're going to be using sort of toxic growth probably as our opener most of the time. So by the time the mobs get to us, they'll be within close range, and we'll just get a little bit more multiplier on this Gas Arrow. So a decent chance to get that 100% explosion damage from toxic growth. And then faster attacks because we want to pop this thing off as fast as we can. Now, because we are a chaos damage setup, applying Wither is super, super strong. Wither in PoE 1 was sort of this insane thing you could stack, 10 to 15 times depending on your ascendancy. And it would just cause the enemy to take so much more chaos damage. It was OP. We don't know how it works exactly in PoE 2 yet, if it's a single stack or if it's like multi-stacks, just like it was in PoE 1. But in any case, we're going to be applying it a lot because there's this skill called Dark Effigy, which is basically a totem that you pop down and every single time. And if an enemy is affected by chaos damage over time debuffs, which it will be, we'll get to that in just a second, it's going to be bombarded by sort of chaos damage, which is a projectile. So any single time it hits, which is seemingly going to be pretty often, it's going to be having a chance to apply this Withering Touch, which will apply Wither. Again, we don't know how many stacks of Wither you can have, or if any stacks of Wither you can have, but it seems like a really good setup. But we could also pair this with multiple projectiles, because again, if you can stack this to like 10, 15 times like you could in PoE 1, this will pop off really, really nicely. And again, cause all the enemies to take way more damage from your poisons, from your chaos damage over time. But one of these sort of like GG aspects of this whole build is this Blasphemy setup that is seemingly super OP. Again, we don't really know how much spirit you'll be able to have in Path of Exile 2, and we don't really know the cost multipliers of all these skills because we're relying on very limited information here. But this is insane. Like if this works the way I think it does, it's insane. So Blasphemy will basically make your curses an aura, and curses can be really, really strong in Path of Exile 2 from what I've seen. If you get curse effect, you get like probably take enemies chaos res to 0, which is GG. Anyways, it turns Despair into an aura, and Despair by default just reduces their chaos res. And again, reducing their chaos res means we do more chaos damage to them, which is more poison damage. We're also going to link it with what's called Decaying Hex, which will make the supported skill, curse skill, a damage over time, a chaos damage over time effect, which is damage we don't really care about. We're probably going to stack a bit of int here, so that's kind of nice. It deals 10% of intelligence damage as chaos damage for 8 seconds. But we're more so using this because this is like basically anything that's going to get in range with us is going to get hit by all these sort of debuffs. Because we're going to link that with Hinder, first of all, which basically says any chaos damage over time inflicted by the supported skills also hinders enemy. Hinder is I believe, a 30% movement reduction. Because, again, Decaying Hex is a chaos dot. They're going to be hindered as well if they even get within range of you. And we're going to double down on that effect by getting a skill gem called Encumbrance, which supported skills have 30% increased effect of slowing. So that Hinder will hit even harder. And then on top of that, there's this cool new skill gem called Chaotic Freeze, which says enemies taking chaos damage over time receive freeze buildup when they get hit by chaos damage. And that's chaos damage from any skill, which is just awesome. So the chance that we freeze stuff is very, very high here, but it's also doubly high because we're going to use a skill called Cast While Channeling. And again, this is kind of contingent on how much spirit we can have. But the reason Cast While Channeling is nice is because BoneStorm's a channeling skill. So the way Cast While Channeling works in Path of Exile 2 is every skill that you link to Cast While Channeling will have sort of a threshold based on the cast time of the skill linked to it. So the comet has a cast time of 1 second. We don't know if that's actually true or not. So we basically take that cast time times 10, so 100 threshold, and we get 60 energy per second while channeling. So just as long as we channel for a little under 2 seconds, we're going to spawn a free comet. We've also linked additional skills to it, but we might take these off because all we're really concerned about is the freeze here. And these could, again, increase that threshold, but it might be fine because we might be channeling for an upwards of like 3-4 seconds at a time for BoneStorm. But of course, linking it with Cold Mastery will make it hit harder. Any spell gem you can add plus levels to is just really, really strong. We're really just worried about that freeze. And of course, we're having another spirit reservation thing here called Cast on Freeze. And this is really important for the setup because again, there's that third effect on BoneStorm, which says if you consume power charge, it causes the spike to explode on impact. So we want to generate as many power charges as we possibly can here. So every single time we freeze something, we're going to cast Profane Ritual on a nearby corpse, which will basically mark a corpse with a Profane Rune, dealing chaos damage over time to nearby enemies. And again, yay, chaos damage. We're doing chaos damage here. When the ritual is complete, a corpse is consumed to gain a power charge. We've also got that link to multiple charge. So supported skills have a 30% chance to grant an additional charge. So we can get, additional charge from consuming that corpse. We're also linking it with Swift Affliction. Supported skills deal 35% more non-ailment damage. That's really important to note with Swift Affliction. This wouldn't work with poisons, only works with chaos damage over time. Really good choice for this particular setup. And then finally, there's a new support gem called Drain Ailment. So basically, this will consume 1 poison on the enemy to make the Profane Ritual deal 35% more damage, which is pretty cool. And then depending on how big of a cost this cast on freeze is and how often we're getting this freeze between Comet and Chaotic Freeze, if we're freezing all the time, we might just pop on an additional spell echo here, and that would make Profane Ritual cast twice. Another kind of fun thing here we could do would be to like maybe add a second skill to cast on freeze, like Contagion. Contagion on its own is probably not going to do a bunch of damage. We do have a link to Drain Ailments and Swift Affliction here, so it's going to be doing a little bit more damage. But the reason Contagion is actually really good in PoE 2 for poison builds is because technically it's going to spread your poisons for you, which is kind of crazy. In PoE 1, it would sort of just spread Contagion and Essence Drain and other, chaos damage over time stuff. But it seems in PoE 2, it spreads your ailment, which could be really, really strong for mapping. So it's something to consider there. We'll probably just leave it in that last link. Now for this last skill, it's not actually Combat Frenzy. We know about this skill gem that exists. It's like a buff gem that basically every single time you dodge roll, you'll summon a clone of yourself. And if that clone dies or expires, you get a power charge. So that's what we would put here. And the thing with the persistent gems, you can link other things to them. So depending on how much, again, we don't really know how much spirit we're going to have, but depending on how much spirit we have, we can add maybe more mana regen through clarity, or, life regen through vitality, maybe even 4% life on kill, increased recovery from flask, because this could be good with Pathfinder. It just depends on what you're sort of missing. But more importantly, we get that additional power charge. So between that and the Profane Rituals, we're hopefully generating quite a few power charges. But on top of that, there's also a skill in the tree that we're definitely going to take. It's called Lust for Power, which is a 10% chance if you would gain a power charge, you instead gain your maximum number of power charges, and you get an additional 1 to maximum power charges. And that is very close to the ranger part of the tree, so we'll definitely be picking that up. And I do think that will probably be the best way, especially on bosses when we're probably not going to have corpses. It'll be the best way to do things. I did also hear about a skill gem that might be coming at launch that generates corpses for you, which would be really nice, actually, especially if we're leveling with Unearth. As far as pathing on the tree is concerned, obviously we're going to want to pick up these poison nodes as fast as we can. Anything that's additional chaos will be quite good as well, because we do have basically everything in this build is chaos damage. The other thing that it might not be incredibly obvious to some of you guys is that there's a lot of projectile nodes on the tree, like loads of projectile nodes. And the nice thing about that is basically everything we have is a projectile. I mean, almost like literally everything besides our Profane Ritual is a projectile. So scaling those projectile nodes, those projectile damage nodes, is a net positive for not only spell skills, but for attack skills. That's why it's like such a good synergy here, which is kind of cool. So yeah, scaling any of those projectile nodes, again, it's going to be a net positive for the build. There's also a very real scenario that some of these projectile nodes will be really worth picking up. There's some that do increase critical strike chance and bonus to nearby enemies. It's like far shot. There's also a chance to pierce, which actually would be kind of nice in this setup, depending on how many skill points we have to sort of invest in our damage. Again, defense is going to be super important here. Through the tree, you can really stack up enough pierce to get over 100% pierce just on the nodes that we can see. And you can get at least 100% chance to collide or chain off of terrain. So like in close proximities, your BoneStorm arrows could be just like bouncing everywhere, which would be really, really cool. Applying even more poisons. The reason I also like BoneStorm here is because escalating toxins, you get increased poison duration for every poison you've inflicted recently, up to a maximum of 100%. So up to 10 poisons recently. And recently, I believe if it's anything up like PoE 1, that's the last 4 seconds. So as long as we're casting a gas arrow or a BoneStorm like once every 4 seconds, this will be up basically 100% of the time and make our poison damage ramp really, really hard. There's also a Herald of Plague skill gem, but we basically get this from Pathfinder, and we might need this last, spot for, more power charges. But this would make it, this does stack with our Pathfinder, so this would make it spread 2 poisons to enemies on death, but that might just be overkill. We'll have to see. Like I said at the start of the video, we'd also have like sort of a starter setup. I do think that BoneStorm will actually be really fun to level with, and there's some really cool synergies with Unearth that are like kind of poggies for leveling and probably for early mapping. But yeah, starting out, level 1, you'll be a Ranger. So I think the skills that you're probably going to get as the game sort of gives you that Act 1 tutorial are going to be very arrow based. But I do believe Vine Arrow happens really early, and Vine Arrow is actually GG and a chaos damage setup, and we'll show you exactly why. But anyways, assuming you get that first skill that you can uncut, you're going to want to pick up a BoneStorm. And then if you get some support gems, physical mastery would be GG. Plus levels is just good for spells. And then actually picking up a brutality really early on, because we're not doing poison damage yet. We're just doing physical damage with BoneStorm, so brutality would be really good to get a 35% more damage multiplier. And then depending how early you get sort of that Pathfinder ascendancy, you could put on a momentum, which again is just a 40% more damage multiplier, as long as you move at least 2 meters with BoneStorm, which would be pretty easy to do, especially once you get that first ascendancy point. But Vine Arrow is insanely strong early on until we get that, crazy debuff, blasphemy, despair strategy, late game. But for starting out, Vine Arrow is really, really strong because you can combine Vine Arrow, which here it says it poisons enemies, but I think on live it actually is a chaos dot. Yeah, so it appears to just be a chaos and not a poison. But anyway, so Vine Arrow, you can combine it with Encumbrance, because Vine Arrow by default slows enemies, so you'll have a 30% increased effect of slowing enemies. So it's very, very strong. But since it is a chaos damage dot, we can also apply a chaotic freeze. So this is like insane amount of CC early game between just these two alone. So very, very strong setup early game. Also Unearth early game is super strong because Unearth minions don't require any spirit. So you're only you don't want to cast Unearth, you want to be casting BoneStorm, but if there's corpses on the ground, you want to cast Unearth to summon minions from those corpses. Early on, just combine this with the minion mastery plus level of minions. Again, plus minion skills is very, very strong. And then minion instability will make them explode. And the reason that's so good is because once you have enough spirit, you're probably want to get yourself a skeletal sniper. And skeletal snipers actually cast a poison nova, just like that gas nova that we do ourselves later on, the gas arrow. But early on, it's basically an on-demand gas arrow that is off the GCD. So you can actually, while you're casting Vine Arrow, you can also cast that sort of skeletal sniper poison cloud at the same time, for the low cost of 90 spirit. And early on, before you get toxic growth, you can combine that with a corrosion, because again, corrosion will break armor. Why is breaking armor good? Again, because BoneStorm is a physical projectile, and so debuffing the armor will make the poison or the physical hit harder. It'll also make the skeletal snipers hit harder because they're physical projectiles. But also, it'll make the summoned minions from Unearth hit harder because they also hit for physical. Another thing you can link with that is deadly poison. So the poison from the skeletal sniper will deal more damage, causing the corrosion to deal more damage. Very early on as well, since we're doing a decent amount of chaos damage here, you're going to want to get Dark Effigy to get that Withering Touch, because again, Vine Arrow is a chaos dot, so we'll proc this Withering Touch. And then eventually we're going to pick up Toxic Growth because it's so good with, you know, the Skeletal Sniper Poison AoE. And then when the minions die, because of this minion instability, the Skeletal Sniper Nova will explode as well, which is kind of cool. And then finally, we're probably going to eventually manually apply a curse. And another thing you can also do here very early on is apply a K Contagion yourself every once in a while, maybe with something like more duration. And the reason Contagion, again, is good because A, it spreads your poisons, which again, we're not really poisoning that much early on, but you can Contagion your unearthed minions. So they like glow purple and they'll always apply their own Contagion anytime they hit, which is actually like really cool. It's great for sort of clearing trash. Again, unearthed kind of sucks. It does suck on bosses, but we did hear through the grapevine there might be a skill that sort of lets you spawn corpses sometimes, like a buff, but we'll see. Any combination of this setup, especially Vine Arrow early on, is just really strong. But of course, that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully this gave you guys some ideas, maybe even for your own builds. Of course, you can watch me play, you know, when the game launches tomorrow. And then, of course, you'll see this build sort of evolve as we play it. Maybe we even give up on it. Who knows? But I'm super excited to play with BoneStorm and sort of build out Poison and PoE 2 for the first time. You can catch me live at twitch.tv, Lord_Fluffy. For the majority of the weekend, I do start a brand new job on Monday, so I won't be able to go that crazy hard this first season, but I'll be streaming as much as I possibly can. But hopefully this video helps some of you guys. As always, like, subscribe, come over to Twitch, ask your questions. We love you guys. Peace out.